Our guest this week on the English Hour on ANN Satellite Television is Elizabeth Jones of the UK Independence Party. And we will be talking about Islam and integrationism in Britain today. We'll be talking about women's rights, and we'll be talking about the forthcoming British general election. Elizabeth Jones joined the UK Independence Party in 2010 and is an elected member of the party's National Executive Committee. She has stood in the past in a bid to become leader of the UK Independence Party. Elizabeth most recently stood as parliamentary candidate for Dartford in the 2015 general election. Previously, she stood for election in the staunchly Labour Dulwich and West Norwood constituency, as well as in the 2012 Greater London Assembly and 2014 European parliamentary elections. Alongside her opposition to military interventionism, Elizabeth identifies migration as one of the UK's main issues and proposes to implement a zero net migration target to balance the number of people leaving the country with those entering. Elizabeth works as a London-based solicitor. Welcome back to the English Hour on ANN Satellite Television. It's good to be here. It's good to have you with us. And we have Elizabeth Jones, who is on the National Executive of the UK Independence Party and has stood for the UKIP at parliamentary level and has, indeed, you've been a guest on ANN before. It's so good to have you with us.
Well, it's a pleasure to be back, and of course we're now facing the general election on the 8th of June.
We are, and we have three subjects, and that's one of them. We're going to talk about Islam in Britain today. We're going to talk about women's rights and issues that affect women in Britain, and we're going to talk about that very issue, the general election. Islam is the second largest religion in the United Kingdom, with Muslims constituting 4.4% of Britain's total population. It is also the fastest growing religion in Britain. Between 2001 and 2009, the Muslim population increased almost 10 times faster than the non-Muslim population. It is no surprise, therefore, that in recent years contentious issues such as burqa clothing, exclusive faith schools, and Islamic Sharia law gripped the British political landscape. Sharia councils in particular have been the subject of much discussion, since many deem Sharia law to be discriminatory against women and incompatible with English and Welsh law. The rise in the number of Muslims in Britain has coincided with an increase in Islamophobic hate speech and assault, with far-right groups such as the English Defence League holding large rallies in English cities with significant Muslim populations. These organised groups oppose the perceived spread of Islamism and Sharia law in Britain. Why is Islam controversial in the UK? Is Islam truly compatible with British values? So Elizabeth, the Islam, Britain, and we have big issues rolling at the moment. And some of them are European issues, pan-European issues. And I know, well, so many, but I know the UK Independence Party has a policy on inclusivity and presumably has a policy on these gritty issues that are gripping us today, like the burqa ban, which we've seen now coming back in Germany, have seen in France. And Islamic banking or Islamic law is another one that certainly I know that you know something seriously strong about because you're a lawyer. Let's address the whole. Well, let's start with the burqa ban. Is UKIP for a ban on the burqa?
The UKIP's rollout for an integrated society is for there to be a ban on face coverings in the public arena, so that you wouldn't be able to wear such a garment if you're entering into an airport, any sort of civil service department, any shared public areas. And that is basically for two reasons. One is the security issue. I appreciate that there haven't been that many issues involving burqas, however. On the 21st of July 2005, one of the bombers escaped wearing a burqa. He was later caught, of course. And we had the Selfridges robbery. I'm sure you're aware of that. We had a gang of men all wearing the burqa, running into Selfridges and running out. And there was a similar style robbery in Essex. So it's a security issue, so that it obviously will assist with the police identification of possible suspects and to give the public confidence. So we've got the security issue, and of course the other issue will be that of integration, so that you are aware of who's around you in the public space. You can, when you're talking to people, you can have an awareness of their facial expressions, and as you're aware, majority of communication between humans, it's said that it is largely non-verbal. We're looking at people's expressions, their facial movements, their lip movements.
So you disapprove of the burqa, just taking it down to a fundamental level. You personally disapprove of women covering their faces?
Personally, whatever any woman decides to wear in the privacy of her own home, or within her relative's home, or with any private space, is entirely a matter for her. Of course, it's her choice. However, unfortunately, the burqa has now, or niqab, the facial covering, now has somewhat become associated with radicalisation. Unfortunately, it has an association with criminality, as I said earlier, about being used by many male criminals in order to cover their tracks.
But is that why you do you disapprove of it? I mean, you say in private use, of course, but I mean, we can all dress up as we like in private use. There have been many scandals about the way some head of Formula One was exposed as dressing as a Nazi for in their party. I mean, people do all sorts of things in private, consenting adults and so forth, or with their families. But what we're talking about is in a public space. And I can dress up as a chicken or wear whatever costume I want to wear in private, and nobody can say boo to me. But in public, what we're talking about is that I'm drawing from this that you would disapprove of the wearing of the burqa in public, basically.
Well, in public spaces, as I say, like airports, public transport zones.
But it's all very well because
schools.
Saying that that's because of a security issue or whatever, but that's kind of dodging the issue. Surely, if you are to have any valid basis for saying wearing the burqa is wrong in Britain, then it would have to be from the point of view that I assume it's your perspective that it represents putting women in a second-class position. I mean, it wouldn't be otherwise. Why? It's either a moral issue, or if it's a mere security issue, there are all sorts of ways around that. In courts, you could have a special place for women. We could find ways around it, I'm sure. But I presume, or I assume, that there's something more fundamental that you regarded as wrong on principle.
Well, it is, as I said earlier, it has become a symbol of radicalisation, and it is excluding women from public space. I mean, you can't communicate with them, woman to woman. If I were dealing with a woman wearing the face covering, I wouldn't be able to communicate with her fully, or to fully understand what she's trying to communicate with me. But
you don't suggest it's wrong from a moral standpoint, from the standpoint of the issue of how women are viewed in regard to... I mean, why are women wearing a burqa? They're wearing a burqa because they need to be protected from men. Is that right?
Well, there are many reasons why women are wearing burqas. In some unfortunate cases, they have no choice. They're being forced into wearing the burqa by male relatives. That's one situation, which of course is abhorrent. You have another situation where they are wearing a burqa, I would say now, with particularly, I would say, in Western Europe, where we have the new phenomenon where we have young women wearing it, whose mothers and grandmothers would never dream of wearing it,
yes,
as an aggressive fashion statement, as a symbol of an association with radicalisation.
Well, throughout the Middle East, throughout the world, more women who have a Islamic heritage are covering up. It's a trend we're seeing, whether you go to Cairo or you go to Misrata or you go to Gaza or you go wherever you go, more women are covering up. And whether that's social pressure or the mood after, it's hard, it's surprising. What, let's take it one step further, because you are also, UKIP also has a policy on faith schools, doesn't it?
It does have a yes, we've got a policy on faith schools, and that is really that we need to have a more inclusive society moving forward to the 21st century, and religion should not be used as a means of excluding youngsters from mainstream society. Now,
just for the benefit of our viewers, the UK Independence Party is of the, if you like, there are four major national parties on the British political scene today. I know that we also have, when I say nationalist, I don't mean nationalist usually refers to the Scottish nationalist or the Welsh nationalist, and they are significant parties. But in terms of pan-British parties that are right across the British political scene, we have the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, the Liberal Party, and then we have the UK Independence Party. And the UK Independence Party is perceived as, perhaps wrongly, the most right-wing of the British parties, even though that's largely because of the Brexit position. But even though on some policies it's quite radical, so it is. But on these integrationist policies, it's probably more hardline than the other three, isn't it?
Well, it depends how you define hardline. It seems to me in the current political atmosphere in the UK, it's very difficult to define what is left and what is right anymore. But if I can go back perhaps to the burqa or face veil ban, that originally, I would say politically, started in 2006 with Jack Straw saying that he was very concerned that
then Home Secretary of Britain,
when he was holding his surgeries, that constituents were coming to see him wearing the full face veil, and he felt he couldn't communicate with them. You know, he felt that there was this unnatural barrier of separation between them, which prevented a proper, a rapport or a proper level of communication. So he went public and was saying basically that he thought that it was a rather exclusionary garment that had no place in British society. Now, I think he has since apologised because of the sheer anger that hit him after saying that. But then, of course, he was also supported by Gordon Brown and Tony Blair, who said it was a mark of separation within the United Kingdom. So that's the Labour Party. So really, the Labour Party, I would say, had the first strike, I would say, against face veil.
But is this kind of racism or not? You don't think so?
It's not racism at all. Of course, how can it possibly be racism? Because, right, number one, it's religion. It's not a race. It's not an actual identified ethnic group. As you're aware, Muslim people come in all shapes and sizes.
Is it Islamophobia?
Not at all. It's not Islamophobia because, as you're aware fully, that many people take the view that it is a customary practice and not necessarily a Quranic practice. So it isn't actually following clearly the full precepts and advice of the Quran. And also, we say Islamophobic. In 2017, Morocco had banned the full face veil. It's not prevalent in Bangladesh. It's not prevalent In Iran, I'm sure you're aware,
In Iran it is, sorry.
in Iran it's not prevalent. They don't cover the face in Iran. I'm sure if you went to Tehran, you wouldn't find many women with
Okay, fair enough. No,
with face coverings.
They have a strict hijab.
They have their job. Well, that's not so strict even now. I think you had a little bit of hair comes out. It's not so tightly bound, and I don't think Iran's, since the revolution's had a policy of face coverings. So you've got Iran, Bangladesh, you've got Morocco 2017 banning the niqab face veil, and also, as you're aware, during the Hajj, no woman is allowed to have the face veil entering the Grand Mosque in Mecca.
What about, I mean, France? They ban headscarves?
Another one, Cairo University's banned it as well because of the communication problem. So how can it possibly be described as Islamophobic when many of the Islamic countries have introduced, if not outright bans, they've introduced qualifications with the wearing of it.
Yeah, you have no problem with the headscarf, though.
No, not at all. Of course not. How could I have a problem with a headscarf? We have a situation where in this country, well, throughout Europe, the world, you have the Jewish population, the male population, choosing to wear the yarmulke, you know, the skull cap. Many Jewish men don't wear it, but many do. So what? You've got the Sikhs wearing the turban. You've got the Sikhs wearing the kippah, the little ceremonial knife. So there are exceptions, but we can't have constant exceptionalism. We've got to reach a stage where there has to be a consensus that within the public arena, because it's in the public arena that countries like Britain and America, which are multifaceted, multi-ethnic, multi-religion, we all get to meet. It's at this juncture that we all our paths cross, and we have to have an agreed glue, an agreed consensus, insofar as we can, that enables us all to get along so that we do not descend into strife or civil war. And
then that's admirable, but then the other issue you've raised, or I've raised, that of faith schools. UKIP is UKIP against faith schools? I know we're talking here, again for the benefit of our listeners, we're talking about schools that are have faith-based education, that are exclusively for Muslim, or exclusively for Christian, or exclusively for Jewish children, or indeed Sikh, or whatever, that are funded by the government. It was a policy that was brought in by the Labour government of Tony Blair. Are you against faith schools?
Well, as you're aware, before Tony Blair's government, the only religious groups who could have the faith schools were the Christians and the Jewish people. Labour opened that up, and in light of the fact that in this country we have had very, very severe religious strife, I'm sure you're aware, of course, during the Elizabethan era with Queen Mary.
That's a little ways back.
I know it's a little way back. I appreciate it's a little way back, but the echoes of that remain in Northern Ireland. We've got a situation where the devolved assembly in Northern Ireland has had great difficulty in moving forward because those two communities,
absolutely,
the
faith schools are a problem in Northern
and the Roman
Ireland.
Catholics, cannot, even to this day.
So would you stop faith schools in Northern Ireland?
Well, Northern Ireland is a very special situation.
It is a huge part of the problem of Northern Ireland, is that they have schools for, again for the benefit of our listeners, they have separate publicly funded schools that are Catholic and separate publicly funded schools that are Protestant. I would certainly like to see them finished and have integrated, forcibly integrated education in Northern Ireland, I think would be. But that's not a UKIP policy, but you are against faith schools in the UK. Well,
the UK obviously will include part of Northern Ireland.
Sorry, I mean in the new
I think that is something that really does have to be examined. I mean, the National Secular Society obviously is very much opposed to faith schools, and really why should the British taxpayer have to be paying towards certain people's particular religious leanings? I mean, I'm not particularly religious. I consider myself to be agnostic. So why should my tax be funding, let's say, Catholic schools?
I take the point. And the final issue, just to square the circle, as they say, or whatever, that we raised at the beginning, the issue of is Islamic law. Do you think there should be an accommodation with Islamic law in British law?
Not within the domestic private arena. No, not at all.
There shouldn't.
Not at all. Not insofar as it clashes with UK law.
So a visitor to this country who has two wives and brings them,
Well, that's perfectly legal if he's married. If his marriage was legal abroad, there's nothing. He's not going to be arrested. If he enters he's not going to be arrested. Polygamous marriage, if it's recognised abroad, will be well, not necessarily recognised, but he's not going to be arrested in this country. He hasn't deemed to have committed a criminal offence.
Interesting. So the but so what? There is no aspect of social Islamic law that is entering our legal system, but there is in terms of Islamic banking.
Of course. Within, it's provided obviously that it is an alliance with the UK law. Of course, there's a huge market now in Sharia-compliant financial instruments, and we were talking earlier about the World Islamic Economic Forum holding its very first forum outside the Muslim world in London, which is a fantastic opportunity for this country. It's about £1 trillion worth of business to be done with Sharia-compliant financial instruments.
And so, in that sense, there is not an issue with Islamic law and British law. It's not a problem.
Well, no, because these Islamic instruments, such as the loan agreements, can be drafted in such a way that they will, of course, be compliant. We can't have financial documents and financial instruments being created in this country or being part of this country's economy which are against the law. So that they will be compliant, but also they'll be drafted in such a way that they will comply with Sharia law. So both parties are happy and it works well in parallel.
Interesting. So basically, no to the burqa, no to faith schools, unless they're, but slight equivocation there, because if they've been around for a while, you're saying maybe.
Well, it does need to be looked at in some very great detail, because the issue, of course, is taxpayers' money. It's coming out of my pocket, it's coming out of your pocket, and we are funding youngsters to only mix with their own people. So you've got the Catholic schools, but now Hindu schools, Church of England, Muslim, Jewish, being funded out of our taxpayers' money.
Yeah, I think we need to get rid. I go further than UKIP on faith schools. I think we need to get rid of all faith schools without question. I think they are divisive in our society in Britain.
I mean, I would agree with that. I think that the way forward, in order for us to have a properly integrated, fast-moving 21st century, everyone needs to know. We all need to know each other, and going to school with each other is certainly a step in the right direction.
Exactly, and Islamic law, no problem as it stands. We're going to have to pause because we need to go on to our second subject. We've certainly overrun on this one. Well, our second subject is women's rights, or at least dimensions of that vast issue. So we're going to talk about that. The United Kingdom has recently come 20th in the so-called gender gap index between countries like Rwanda, the Philippines, and South Africa. According to recent reports by the World Economic Forum, much progress has been made to place women on an equal footing with men in life in Britain today. British women have a higher life expectancy than men. There is increased representation of women in politics, with more women than ever holding prominent roles in both government and in the opposition. And the gender pay gap for those in their 20s has significantly reduced. Despite these improvements, expert economists and journalists have admitted there is more room for improvement. Female genital mutilation, or female circumcision as it's sometimes known, is still rampant in the UK today. Sexual harassment in the workplace is also a problem many women face, and sexual exploitation and trafficking of women remains an industry in its own right, producing millions of pounds worth of profits for the traffickers. So, Elizabeth, women's rights. This is exciting because it's an issue close to my heart. Now, we want to talk about equality for women, and that means that we're not the same, you and I, because men and women are not. But it means that we have and equal value, basically, isn't it, in the eyes of God or in the eyes of each other, more to the point. And yet society is still a broken place, and still in Britain we don't have true, what I would deem true equality of opportunity, or in any of its dimensions, true fair play between women and men. It's not an equal playing field. Where do we go with this? What really concerns you in terms of women's rights?
Well, I don't think Britain is quite as bad as you've portrayed there. I think
Okay.
Seriously, Britain is one of the few places in the world where women have lives of purpose and dignity. So it's not so bad. You've portrayed it as rather a bleak dystopia for women. But Britain, of course, does have its problems, but it isn't really so bad. Compared to the rest of the world. It's doing quite well. I mean, the focus really would be to help people, or women who are experiencing difficulties abroad, and of course to ensure that there's more gender equality in the UK. I mean, the UK situation, I think we were discussing earlier, we've got the problem, as we were saying, about FGM, female genital mutilation, whereby that was outlawed in this country, I believe, in 1985, and since then there has not been one prosecution. I think two people, I think it might have been a doctor and a nurse, please forgive me if I'm a bit hazy about that, were actually charged by the police, but I think they were found not guilty. And I was just reading as I was coming here a report, I think it was in the Telegraph, saying that about every 90 minutes in this country a young girl is reported somewhere within the NHS system as having been a victim of FGM. Now I say victim obviously because they're youngsters, they're children, they can't give their consent to such an operation. And why this is important is because these girls will be, they will never really sort of be fully integrated within our society because they have been effectively made into sexual eunuchs.
Well, it's not quite that bad,
well,
is it?
it's not quite that bad, but there is that, they have been, they're not operating as fully functioning humans as they would in full adulthood. Also, many of these operations are botched. So these poor girls will be experiencing pain, discomfort, embarrassment, potentially throughout their adult lives. And that, of course, is a burden on the wider society because they're going to be an ongoing strain on the NHS and perhaps social services around them. And if they are really experiencing severe problems as a result of this, they may never be able to sustain full-time employment. So it's a ripple effect from that one incision, that one cut to these poor young girls, that effect ripples throughout the whole of British society.
Now this is, what some would call female circumcision. At least that's the concept. Ridiculous, actually, but nonetheless, that is the concept. And the so-called reason that's given for these operations taking place, and they are taking place within particular groups with a particular heritage, often the Somali or sometimes the Sudanese community, and others too. It's uncommon, but it happens. It's basically what we're saying. I'm staggered by your figure of one reported every 90 minutes.
Well, that's what I was reading on the way here in an
Wow.
article, recent article.
But it's, what should we do about it? You feel we're not militant enough in addressing this problem here in Britain?
Well, I think militant is the wrong word to use. All you have to do is actually apply the law. In 1985 there was a law prohibiting this activity, and no one seems to want to proceed with any form of prosecution. I appreciate it has to be done very sensitively because these children, obviously, if they are going through the criminal prosecution process, it could potentially be their parents or close relatives who are the ones going to be subject to conviction. And of course that will have an impact perhaps on their ability to earn, or they will have that mark against them as being a convicted criminal. So it's a very difficult, it is very difficult, I understand that. And of course I appreciate that many of the perhaps the local authorities are very, very worried about having the label of racist or Islamophobic, if indeed it is. It's not always a Muslim situation, but more often than not it is in the UK. They're frightened of that label, but something really does need to be done about this.
So, and you again, just to be clear, because you rightly highlighted the health dangers and the dangers to the young girls leading a full life if she's subjected to FGM. But even if somebody argues with you about that, there's the underlying, presumably an underlying moral issue, isn't it? It is, as with any of these issues, there is a moral issue, I would assume, that this is wrong because you are...
well, that's right. It's always singling out the females. I mean, we just discussed earlier about the burqa ban again, singling out the women. Why is it I mean, fair enough, if both the men and women covered up, I could perhaps see some rationale behind that. Well, not really rationale, but I could understand perhaps some more of the thinking of it. But it's always the woman. So the woman has to be covered up. It's the young girl who's going to be suffering significantly with this FGM. So, you know, it basically, it's just not fair. It's not fair.
And it's powerfully said, and I'd agree with you on that issue 100%. Are there, coming back to other aspects of women's rights, because you said Britain is not doing that badly in other respects, but are there other particular areas that you would highlight that you think we should improve even here in Britain, let alone worldwide, with regard to our attitude to women? I mean, society's attitude to women. Well,
yes, I mean, if we look at Parliament itself, I think only about 20-25%, please forgive me if I've misremembered that, of our MPs are women. I think that really does need to be addressed because it's not reflective of the population. And one thing I always find very, very, it always makes me laugh, is that you have organisations, parties like the Labour Party, the Lib Dems, always espousing equality and fairness, and yet it's always been the Conservatives who have had the high-ranking female politicians. Of course, we had the Mrs Thatcher, and now we have Mrs May.
Yes.
And yet, it's not the Conservatives who are pushing that agenda. So I find that quite interesting that Labour has never had a female leader, and I don't envisage that it ever will. So I think they need to readjust their attitudes in line with their message. If they're genuinely for equality, then prove it. Whereas the Conservatives don't espouse that and yet have Mrs May as their leader. So I think we need to do more about encouraging more women to go into politics. Again, we need to, I think the STEM subjects, that's the science, technology, engineering and medicine, need to be more attractive to women. And interestingly enough, we're talking about touching on Islamic issues. If we look at countries like Iran, of course, many of the Iranian women are encouraged very much to go in for engineering, or go in for electrical engineering, and these heavy-duty engineering subjects, which is quite not perhaps what you would necessarily expect, but that's the educational drift for Iran. Where in the UK, it tends to be more arts-based subject, but I think that needs to be changed, and more girls need to be encouraged to go for the STEM subjects. Also, the other issue we have in the United Kingdom, which I think should be dealt with, I don't know, perhaps tax breaks, is the issue of fertility. Because if women are to go ahead with careers and become leaders and drivers in their respective fields, of course that is a trade-off with having children. And I think that there needs to be a government policy of, or perhaps within private companies, to encourage female staff to have their eggs frozen.
Good Lord.
So I think that would be quite an encouragement and a liberating aspect for many career women.
That's a really, I mean, that would always be a very fringe. It's actually quite invasive, isn't it?
It may be invasive, however, it is becoming increasingly common. And I think it means that there'll be a lot of pressure off women. We have to accept, as you were saying earlier, that we are equal, but we are different. For instance,
so you're talking then having your eggs frozen and then implanting them.
That's a later date, at a time that's...
In yourself, not in a surrogate mother.
No, for let's say you're a career woman. Let's say, for instance, you're an outstanding electrical engineer, for instance, and you're at the cutting edge of IT. And of course, as you're aware, AI is going to be the future of driving the world's economy. You know, you're at the absolute cutting edge, right? And of course, at some point, you may want to have children or family, but the concentration, your mental energy and focus has to be on this in order to keep up with it. What are you to do? You know, that is a big trade-off for many career women. So one way around that would be, I would say, for these private companies, indeed Google, I believe, and Facebook offer that as a term of their employment, that you have your eggs frozen, so at a later date you can have them implanted in yourself.
It's a surprise.
And time your family so that you
Certainly.
can keep up and keep on top of the career cycle.
But it is certainly true that women are disadvantaged by being the child bearer, disadvantaged in career terms, and yet it makes them the most important of the two sexes for exactly the same reason, because they're the nurturer and the child bearer. It's an interesting issue, fascinating issue, and in other respects, you reckon we're not doing too bad. I reckon we have the other side of the coin. I think that women are exploited by our very materialistic society that puts sexual pressure on women, that we live in a society that is makes women into, forgive me, into sex objects in the West, and it. Of course, we are all sexually driven, because we're otherwise there'd be no procreation and there'd be no children. So I'm not suggesting that's wrong, but the commercialization of the sexuality of women, where you can't advertise a product or whatever without the pretty girl, I mean, I think we've gone a little too far in the West. And it's degrading, but maybe...
Well, I think you may have a case for that perhaps in the 1970s, whereby the advertising then was quite outrageous. I'm sure you remember, you were showing our age now, William, I'm sure you remember the style of the motor industry,
yes,
with its advertising, where you'd have some lovely young girl in a bikini splayed across the bonnet of the latest car,
yes,
in a quite sexually provocative manner. But I don't think you would get that now. I think the tide has turned, and I think that there is a more sophisticated approach to advertising. Of course, I mean, female beauty and male beauty as well. Human beauty is highly valued. Everyone in the world enjoys gazing upon a beautiful face, whether that's male or female. It's as we were saying, it's part of human nature. So I don't think that it's necessarily sexually exploitative. I think it's a bit. If it results in young girls, perhaps under the age of consent, being pushed into sexual situations that they don't want, then yes. But I think that would be a bit of a tenuous link, attaching that to a billboard of a woman, perhaps advertising a bra.
We were going to have to. We could go on actually for the rest of the programme just talking about this subject, but we want to talk, because you are standing for election. We want to talk about the forthcoming UK general election. So we're going to have to reluctantly leave this subject and move on to the British general election, and yourself, and you standing at the United Kingdom Independence Party. Well, let's talk about that.
At this moment of enormous national significance,
Prime Minister Theresa May has called a general election on the 8th of June this year, 3 years earlier than she might otherwise have had to do. Mrs. May's official reason for holding an election is to strengthen her hand in Brexit negotiations. She claims Labour, the Scottish National Party, and the Liberal Democrats will try to destabilise and frustrate the process in Parliament. Mrs. May is also tied to the promises made by the Conservatives at the 2015 election. She has made few changes to her policies at that time. She continues to back grammar schools and plans to ease and reduce the financial deficit. But an election gives her the chance to set her own new vision for Britain. According to the most recent polls, the ruling Conservative Party have a significant lead over Labour, the second biggest party in the country. Taken at face value, this political strategy may seem to be a carefully calculated gamble. But will it succeed or will it backfire? So this is exciting, Elizabeth. You are standing for election at the general election, and you're standing for the London constituency,
Yes.
which is, let's get this right,
Bermondsey and Old Southwark.
Bermondsey and also just across the river.
That's right, yes.
Very, very close to central London.
Yes.
I wish you well, genuinely, I wish you well. It's going to take place, the election will take place on June the 8th. UKIP had a remarkably, the UK Independence Party had a remarkably good showing at the last general election, and yet didn't get, they got one MP by defection, because their vote was spread right across the nation, and therefore wasn't high enough in a single place because of our system to kick an MP through. Do you want our political system reformed? Are you happy with it?
Well, I'm not particularly happy with it. I think there are far too many MPs. I would abide by the Boundary Commission proposals. I think that we've reached a stage now with this country. This country has such a large population now, and the population is far better educated than I think it was when the rules with regard voting began originally. And I think there's a lot to be said for direct democracy. There's a lot to be said for having a lot more referendums.
What's direct democracy meaning, referendums?
Yes, we need a lot more. I would say we need more referendums, so there can be far more electorate engagement. I don't see why in this day and age we need to hand over our voice to an MP when we have our own voice, and most people now have access to the internet and have access to a far broader reach of knowledge than ever before.
I'd agree with you there. So, and we will, but this is not going to affect our election on June the 8th.
No, it's not going to have any impact. No, not at all.
And the election was called by our Prime Minister, Theresa May, in order to give, or ostensibly in order to give herself a stronger mandate for the negotiations to take Britain out of Europe. And obviously it was a canny move in any case, because she's still in her honeymoon period as Prime Minister, and she has a chance to increase the Tory majority. So there may have been an element of sheer selfish pragmatism involved. From a UKIP point of view, UK Independence Party, it'll be a tough election for you, no?
From the point of view of getting representation in Parliament, maybe we are pinning our hopes on Hartlepool in the northeast of England, which we have done very well in the past, also Hayward and Middleton. So we're focusing on the northern seats, which are not so attractive to the Tories. However, UKIP has always been more about than just getting MPs, and our policy this time round will be to ensure that we give maximum support to existing Brexit MPs. For instance, I live in the parliamentary constituency called Vauxhall, which is sort of south of the river.
Yes.
And the MP there is a mature woman called Kate Hoey. She's Labour, and she has been a staunch Brexiteer. She believes in the voice of the people. So, because she is a Brexiteer, we have made a policy decision not to stand a candidate against her.
Did you stand last time against her?
Yes, we did.
And you decided to, that's very interesting. So you're not going to stand against her, you're not going to stand against other...
Anyone, well, no matter what party they're in, if they're, they could be Conservative, Labour, Plaid Cymru, SNP, not that it'll be any SNP or Plaid Cymru, whatever party they are, it's party blind. If they are a strong pro-Brexit voice, we are not going to stand a candidate against them, because we want to be... It's a very delicate situation now with the Brexit negotiations. we want to ensure that Britain, it's country first, we want to ensure that Britain has a free hand to negotiate the best possible deal for this country to ensure that we have the best possible financial future and the greatest happiness for our population. So that's why we don't want to prejudice any or impact on any way.
Does this mean that the UK Independence Party is a one-issue party?
We're not a one-issue party. As we discussed earlier, we had a platform of policies with regard to integration in the UK. We were discussing the issue with regard to the face veil, the niqab, the burqa. We were discussing the issue with FGM. We were discussing the issue with faith schools. So those are very strong policies which the other parties would not have the courage to make public. So we are still here. We are still giving a radical voice to UK. But for our strategy for this election, because it's so soon after the Brexit vote, that we want to ensure that the situation is not hijacked by people who would seek to deny the country its voice. So wherever there's a strong Brexit MP, we will not be standing against them.
So you got at the last general election, you got a remarkably high vote. I would say, if my memory serves me, then nationally you got a higher vote than the Liberal Party. Is that right?
That's right. I think we got about 4 million.
Yeah. Well, that was a remarkable achievement. You think you can sustain that in this election?
Well, in this election, probably unlikely, because we've had the Brexit vote and many people were supportive of UKIP purely because of Brexit.
But in terms of parliamentary representation, whereas last time you got no MPs, this time you generally hope to have some members of Parliament.
We may get one. I'm hoping that we'll get one perhaps in Hartlepool or maybe one in Hayward and Middleton. But if we don't, I mean, obviously I would very much like us to have parliamentary representation, but if we don't, and if as a result of our party putting country before party, we have a strong Brexit hand, then we will have done what we can for the nation.
Done what you can, but you see a future for the UK Independence Party beyond Brexit?
It depends how Brexit proceeds, whether we're going to have a clean Brexit, whether it's going to be in the best interest of this country. I, of course, expect the government or Theresa May to fudge it. She wasn't a very effective Home Secretary.
No, I don't. Funny, I
don't expect her to be particularly effective with Brexit, to be honest.
But I've garnered some sort of respect for her since she's become Prime Minister. I think I would agree with you that she was an ineffective Home Secretary, but she seems to have got a stronger grip on things since she's become Premier.
Well, but she hasn't actually done anything as yet. I mean, all she's done is talk. Nothing actually has happened. We haven't actually got any negotiation up and running.
No, but...
And she delayed the invoking of Article 50 for as long as she possibly could. So much time has been wasted. Perhaps if she'd invoked it earlier, we would be further forward, and the international financial markets would have a clear idea as to how the future planning.
Okay, well, fair enough, but that is a reasonable perspective. I'm not sure, whatever, but if she delivers a tough position for the UK and for a new independent of Europe UK, is there a future for the UK Independence Party beyond, if we have what you personally would regard as successful and effective British removal from Europe? Is there a future for your party, the UK Independence Party, beyond that point?
Yes, I would say so, because we are the only radical party that will actually openly discuss policies and ideas which other parties would shy from.
Specifically?
Well, as I said earlier today, we were discussing the UKIP integration policies, the platform with regard to the burqa, FGM, faith schools. No other party is going to openly make any declaration with regard to policy concerning those issues. Also, UKIP has been staunchly 100% anti-liberal interventionism, and I'm sure you've heard today and yesterday Boris Johnson saying he thinks he could not say no to Donald Trump's request to bomb Syria.
Even though we're much better at broadcasting, it probably won't be today or yesterday by the time our viewers see it, maybe last week. But anyway, but we are pretty fast now, so it will probably be last week. I would. That's very interesting, because this stance that Boris has taken, with saying he wouldn't even consult Parliament, or implying that he wouldn't even consult Parliament. If Trump chose to bomb Syria, then he'd be there with him.
Exactly. Now, that's not what I want, and I'm sure it's not what any of our members would want. And these are things that need snap referendums. Who on earth is he to drag this country into military conflict? And who on earth is he to inflict military damage on another country? Who is he? What mandate does he have to do that?
Would you regard that? Would you say not just in regard to Syria, but in regard to all military intervention?
Of course, unless there's a clear British interest, such as there was with the Falklands, where we had a British population down there saying that they needed assistance because they'd been invaded by the Argentines, and perhaps with Gibraltar. Other than that, no, it needs very, very careful consideration, because we don't really understand the very complex alliances and history of many of these regions and why these situations have arisen. And I don't think it's turned out very well. I mean, do you really think that Tony Blair's interventions, David Cameron's intervention in Libya, do you think that's really turned out well? Do you think that's helped those countries?
No, I think in terms of the intervention in Libya, it was utterly futile from the beginning. Although that doesn't mean that I think Gaddafi was the best thing since sliced bread, as we say here. But in terms of Iraq, it's sad, isn't it? I felt at the time that the intervention was right, because there have been so many attempts to bring Saddam Hussein to the table and get him to... I felt. But then, for me, our subsequent behaviour was wrong in regard to Iraq.
And now, of course, we've got Islamic State right in the middle of Raqqa. So, well, thank you, Tony Blair.
Yes, exactly.
So UKIP will always be opposed to military interventionism. It just doesn't... I can't see how it works. I don't see who it benefits. It obviously probably benefits companies like Raytheon, who are selling the missiles and the bombs, I'm sure.
You're not... you're against... I mean, we are one of the big arms proliferators in the world. I mean, I don't know who's first, China or Russia or the United States. But I'm sure after the big three, or France is pretty bad as well, but after the big 3 or 4, if we're not in 5th position or 4th position, we're somewhere up there as the world's big arms proliferators. I mean, would you be against that, our present behaviour?
Well, I suppose it's a difficult question with regard to our economy, because I understand we do receive a lot of income from that trade.
We do, yes.
And but I thought we've already got strict rules and laws in place with regard to who we can and cannot trade with.
Well, that I would seriously question. But we'll have to do. You know, I mean, that's been fascinating. I would like to go on. We haven't even scratched the surface, but we are going to have to stop. A last word from you, Elizabeth. I mean, you are about to stand for Parliament in Britain, and yes, what really, just in a paragraph, what's your big driving belief? Where are we at now? Sum it up for our listeners and for the world. What's your passion with regard to this election?
My passion with regard to this election, in a super localised...
Any which way.
Okay. My passion for this election is to give voice to those who voted Brexit, and I'd be best positioned to do that in Bermondsey and Old Southwark, because the main contenders, Labour and Lib Dem, both the candidates there, are complete and utter Remainers. So anyone who has voted Brexit will have a democratic voice and can put their cross against my name.
Well, good luck to you, and thank you very much for being our guest on ANN Television. I hope you do well.
And thank you very much.
Well, that was certainly interesting, and Elizabeth, of course, has been our guest before on ANN Satellite Television, and you'll remember perhaps that interview. I am fascinated with the whole question of integrationalism in our society. That it's one that we've not dealt with well, in my view, here in Britain. I think that faith schools are a problem in the United Kingdom, and I would like to see them all banned, whether they're Christian or Muslim or Hindu or Jewish or Sikh. We have faith schools for each of these in large numbers, and I think that it causes division. It makes our society more broken and less inclusive, and we need an inclusive society. It's the big problem, isn't it, with the world today, is people don't feel they belong. I've met young British people who are born here who feel they are not British. That's got to be wrong. An inclusive society, everybody must feel they belong. Every minority must feel they belong and are part of your society. And that applies whether you're talking about Syria or you're talking about Egypt, where we've seen the killing of Copts not so long ago, or whether you're talking about Iran or Afghanistan, or you're talking about wherever. And it certainly applies to a nation like the United Kingdom. We need to be inclusive. All of our people should feel they belong and have an equal value placed on one another. So I don't think faith schools is an appropriate way forward, certainly for our nation. And secular education is what I believe in, even though I'm very religious myself. And then we talked about women's rights. Women don't have true equality, I don't believe, not here in Britain. I slightly differ from Elizabeth's point of view. I think that women are exploited by the media, and continue to be exploited in our society in the West, and that we cannot preach to the rest of the world if our society is so, what is the word, treats women in regard as second-class citizens. Now I know Elizabeth thinks we're way beyond that, and perhaps my perspective is not your perspective, but there you go. I think it is an issue we should deal with. The third and final matter we discussed, well, this coming election is going to be interesting for the British people, interesting for Britain. And will UKIP, the UK Independence Party, do well? I suspect it will get 1 or 2 seats this time around. Whether the Liberals do well is another question. Whether the Labour Party, with its controversial leader Jeremy Corbyn, does well is another question. But one thing is clear, that unless the Conservative Party makes some major gaffe between now and June the 8th, then Theresa May, the British Prime Minister, is going to come through with a thumping majority, which will enable her to do whatever she pleases. It's a while since we've had a strong leader in Britain. It's a while since we've had a strong female leader in Britain. There are similarities between her and Margaret Thatcher. Is it good? Is it bad? I'll leave it to you to make your own judgment. But for the world, I would hope that she becomes less interventionist than some of the past premiers in Britain, because intervention has not generally helped, in my view. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for being our guests on ANN Television. God bless you all.